Hello everybody, welcome back to this second part of the Jung Talks, the delineation series about the chart of Carl Gustav Jung uh, from the perspective of traditional astrology, which in my case as a Hellenistic practicing astrologer, these things that I present here are of course Hellenistic in origin, strongly based on the teachings of Robert Schmidt and his research and restoration of Hellenistic astrology and everything that came out of that. So welcome back, and let's have a look at this second part. This second part of this series about Jung will address the issues of the dignities, and I will especially be talking about the function of the separate dignities, because one of the things that made a very big difference in studying Hellenistic astrology, as Schmidt discovered, was that the dignities have a specific sort of relation to any planet having to do with them. So it's very important to get to the heart of what this actually meant, as seen from a Hellenistic perspective, which changed dramatically sometimes in later traditions of astrology. I will be talking about the dignity, of course, of the issue that I'm still investigating in his chart, which is, of course, the planet Saturn, which is the ruler of the first place and thus the representative of Jung himself in his own chart. So that's very important to take into account. So as these presentations can be quite long, I will be treating of the dignities separately. So I will first talk about the dignities in general, what to do with them and what not to do with them, and then I will go into the dignities separately, but I will do this in separate videos because otherwise the videos would be long, very long. So let's have a look. So here is the list of essential dignities pertaining to Jung's chart. So you can see the ruler, the exaltation ruler, the triplicity rulers, the bound rulers, and the face planet. Please understand that this is an ensemble of planets that the images have as their administrators, so to speak. They are their crew, and they have nothing to do with strength. So please refrain from counting them up, because that is something that happened a lot in later traditions based on the influence of Ptolemy, who was one of the first one who started doing the Almutin routine by counting up all these different essential dignities and then coming up with a victor, the planet that has the most counts in this thing. And Schmidt always said when astrologers started counting things up, they stopped thinking. And that rather derogative remark was aimed at people who stopped thinking about what is actually expressed with these several dignities, these several tasks that planets have, and you cannot count up tasks and then say, well, this planet is stronger because it has more counts in this way. So, well, that's a bad habit, and I will try to illuminate for you what the differences are and what the actual function is of a certain planet. And it's also a bit aimed at the habit of people using these sort of dignities to enhance a certain delineation that they, or conclusion that they came to by means of a chart, and then piling up sort of evidential things. It must be indicated by 2 or 3 more indications, and then we are relative certain about a certain delineation. Well, that's Schmidt also said that is nonsense as well. Each planet speaks for itself, and it does so by means of configurations that I talked about in the previous video, and they do so in the way of essential dignities. So let's have a look. The first thing to do is what you see here is one of the ways that these dignities are often showed in later traditions and in modern software. This is the software Planet Dance, free software, great. And you see the extra rings around the zodiac on the outside of the zodiac circle. And the first one in this case is the confines, the bounds, and you can see where each planet, in which bound each planet is located. And the last ring around this chart are the decanates, the decans, prosapon, the masks, as it were. So I will be addressing all these several different dignities by means of the way that Schmidt treated of them, and of course he did so by using the ancient Greek language to try to come to grips with this. So the terminology also changed. Schmidt didn't talk about sign rulers only out of convenience in certain talks, because people were more able to follow what he was referring to, but actually the ruler of the image is the Domicilemaster, and that's the term that he often used, and I will try to do so as well, but I might slip back into the old or the modern terminology, but it is the Domicilemaster. So Mars is the Domicilemaster of both the Ram and the Scorpion. Then there is the terminology of the bounds, which is a term used to translate the term, which is of course a quite silly indicator of a principle that has the double meanings, because the word term can refer to something else as well. The terms of endearment, the terms of etc., etc. So, but that carries something of the way these bounds actually function, or what their role is for a certain part of an image. So Schmidt first translated it as bounds, and later he said that confines was the definite translation of the word that he used for what was indicated as terms, which I will be addressing as well. Oh, I need to say that I believe I did so, but these essential dignities need to be treated quite extensively, so I will be doing so in several videos, because otherwise they would be way too long. And of course the word face is will be translated as decan or decanate to differentiate it from the way Ptolemy used the word face, which has to do with the position of planets in a certain chart relative to the place of these planets in the chart, having a relation to the domicile of the sun and the domicile of the moon. And whenever a planet in a certain chart has this same sort of relation that it has in the relation to the lion and the crab, then this was called face by Ptolemy. But I will not be using that definition of face. I will be using the word decan or decanate. So another important thing to remember is that there are no ancient texts, Greek texts, that delineate planets in exaltations nor in decans. So there is something important going on, because later traditions did, and I think you can find some delineations based on this relationship. Planets in the exaltations of other planets, but they were never delineated. So this says something about the way these things were conceived and how they were used and how they needed to be used. So I will be addressing that as well, of course. Okay, so we need to talk about all sorts of relations of planets with images as the crew. These planets have functions. They are the personnel. They are the caretakers sometimes of an image. They have specific roles for certain parts of an image, etc. So that's very important. And the interesting thing is that Schmidt said that the word oikodespoteia is both used for the Domicilemaster, for the exaltation lord, but also the bound lord, the lord of the confines, and the triplicity ruler. So that's a bit confusing, because how can they all be understood and captured by the term oikodespoteia without reducing them to the same type of relationship? And that's of course a very important question, because when you all call them rulers, which is a word that Schmidt detested, and I will explain why, then you can easily step into the trap of seeing them all as some sort of same principle, and then you can count them up because they are all simply principles of having to do with rulership, right? So, and you can see that in the basic course, part 4, Schmidt addressed these issues in 5 separate topics, 5 separate tapes, so you can understand that this is quite an intensive study on his part to come to grips with what this actually meant. So that's quite something and quite an achievement as well. So, okay, now let's first state some principles. The dignification is a matter of the relationship between the images and planets, and rulership, again, this word that Schmidt was not quite happy with, has to do with the relationship between planets, between themselves. Okay, so this is what I will be talking about. Again, I will do it separately, but let's first have a look at something to take into account. So let me first refer you to a video that you can find here on my YouTube channel. I gave the address with the green arrow. I did a webinar for Acuta for nightlight astrology, and I will be showing something, some part of it, because it was relative to what I'm talking about now. So let's have a look at that. And the thing I want to show you is the idea of counting up all these sorts of separate dignities, as they are called, the dignitaries that the planets are in relation to images and certain parts of images. And well, ever since Ptolemy, and especially the Arab astrologers, used almutants all the time, and they simply counted up the several dignities, and then the strongest one of them was called the almutin, the victor, the one that's most strong for this position. And Schmidt hotly debated that issue, and he said, well, you cannot do it, because then you got something like this. That's how I translate it. You're actually saying, well, I have a bike and I have a moped and I have a small car, and when I count them up, I actually have sort of a lorry, a big transportation car, what you call them, a lorry, something big. And that's quite silly, because you cannot do that, simply because these are separate things, and you cannot count them up and join them into one thing and say, well, this actually is something else. That's that's not right. So what I said in that video on the webinar on nightlight astrology is that it can be about multitasking. So whenever you see one planet having several tasks for a certain image, you actually have to say that it's multitasking. It's not about strength, but it's about a certain task, and these are combined, because in that case a planet has several tasks to fulfill for a certain image, be it the image in totality or a certain part of it. And then you need to say something else about it, because then we are talking about different roles that a planet has in relation to the same image. And whenever a planet is there, then you can say that this planet that has more rulership counts, then you must say that this planet is busy multitasking for this planet that is in this place, this part of a image in a chart. So let's make a difference here. You can talk about power in the world, which has to do with strength, which is also a location in place that has to do with quantity. And you can talk about power in principle, and that's a location in own images or parts of them, and that has to do with a certain quality. So that's an interesting difference, and also very good way to try to understand what's happening with planets whenever they are in dignity and whenever they are in certain places. So make a difference between quantity and quality. That's very important for these significations of the separate dignities. Okay, so well, let's start with the presentation of the separate dignities, and I'll start with the first one. So this is what Schmidt presented, of course, and how he analyzed the words used for these several oikodespoteia, the several rulers of certain parts of images, the rulers of them, the masters of these certain parts or images, and how I used them, and how I understood them, and then from that on used them, and how the first thing that we need to address is the way that certain planets have relationships with the entire sign of a zodiac. So these are not about parts of images, but the totality of it, so the 12 images. So the first one is the most important one. It's called the Domicilemaster, the host of a domicile. I addressed this many times in other talks, and I will do so now again, but now in relation to the chart of Jung, of course. Let's first do the analysis by means of etymology. Schmidt said that this word comes from oikodector, and doctor comes from decomai, to give ear to something, to receive, to take on a certain task, to take up, to accept this task, to take upon oneself, to receive in a welcoming way, and in the italics, to welcome or receive someone in your home, and giving ear to their wishes. And that last thing is very important in understanding what the dignity of the Domicilemaster actually represents in a chart. So Schmidt said it is the paradigmatic oikodespoteia, it is the master of that house, the domicile. So, and this of course has to do with the very interesting word oikos, which means place, and our house. Oikeiosis is the process of familiarization, familiarizing yourself with certain places. So, as Schmidt said, the domicile of a planet is not a place where it is a visitor or a tenant. It is a place that belongs to it as its own household. And that's a very important statement about what the task is of the Domicilemaster. So, Schmidt said it's actually the sine qua non of astrological delineation. It's an extremely important relationship and a very deep underlying principle. And he said that it's misleading to represent it as an authority relationship where the domiciliary commands the guest around. The responsibility of that planet is to satisfy the wishes or the desires of the guest. So that is quite something else, as in contrast to how it's used today mostly. So that's important. So here we have the principle of oikeiosis, familiarization. So when you see, that's interesting because this is actually a domicile. So it's not a house, it's a domicile where planets reside. And the most important one is the Domicilemaster, who is the host of this domicile. So whenever a guest is there, the Domicilemaster receives it. We hope, of course, because when the Domicilemaster is in aversion, there's something else going on, which I will address later. So yeah, it's about welcoming the guest into your house and then treating them and having make sure that they have a good time. Okay, so in other talks I represented it as this. You can say that a planet in an image, the guest, is sort of a potter, and the host provides this potter with clay, and the potter can try to make something with this material, and that is actually what's going on. So the host provides the guest with material. It's his own or her own material, and the guest is free to do with it what it wishes. And that's a very interesting, different take on what you can do with a planet in a domicile of another planet, because then you can change the way in which you understand what's happening, what's going on with these two planets. And I will show you how I use this in the chart of Jung. So the task of the Domicilemaster is providing for the guest in its domicile. So the planet, the host is delivering stuff, so to speak. The stuff is, of course, the planetary significations, the topics of a certain planet, and the guest can have his way with it. So whenever you read very ancient texts about, for instance, Saturn and Mars, Kronos and Aries, then you will see that these two planets, as being the guest in a certain image, are not always that friendly with the material that is given to them. So they destroy it, or they do something nasty with it, whatever. And that, of course, depends on all things being equal, but that's what the bottom line is of these sort of interpretations. Yeah. So you can also say that each planet in each life of a person is trying to familiarize himself or herself with the material that the Domicilemaster is providing that planet with, as per the image where this planet is in the natal chart. So that's a very interesting principle. In the webinar that I talked about, I gave this example because when you start reading ancient delineation texts and recipes with this idea in mind, you can see quite a different take on what it actually is saying. So I use this one from the Liber Hermetis. When you have Saturn in Aries or Scorpio, Mars is the host and he provides for Saturn, and Saturn can do with the Mars stuff to his liking. And he does so in accordance with his own Saturnine nature. That's a very important principle. And when you acquaint yourself with this way of reasoning, then you will go very far in delineating what's happening with planets in a certain image under the Domicilemaster of that image being the host for that planet. So if you look at this delineation from the Liber Hermetis, this recipe, so when Saturn, this is the quote, when Saturn, the guest, is in sect, this is a day chart, in the house of Mars, which is the host, or in his face, there we have the decan again, or degree, which refers to the bounds, the confines of Mars in a certain image, then it makes the completing of a task difficult. Interesting, because this is what Saturn is doing with Mars. Mars is the planet that responds to having a task, and Saturn makes it difficult. Okay, interesting. You see, so you see that Saturn is doing something with Mars, right? Mars is the material, the clay, and the potter is Saturn, and Saturn has difficulty making something out of this material that Mars is providing him with. Those who have made enemies evilly. Enemies is, of course, an issue of Mars, and Saturn treated this Mars by being evil, etc. But the bottom line is that what you can see here is that these statements have nothing to do with the images. They are simply about the Domicilemaster and what the guest is doing with the Domicilemaster, and that is the reason that even in later medieval traditions, what you saw was that there were, whenever they were about to give recipes, what happens when planet A is in the Aries, in the Ram, or in the Bull, or in the Twins, etc. They never talked about the images themselves, but always stated this in terms of when Mars is in the domicile of Saturn or Jupiter or whatever. So they say we're now going to talk about recipes of planets in images, and then they never talked about images again. They simply were talking in a way about this, like I've shown here now in this part of this slide, how a planet that is the guest treats its host. And that's a very interesting thing. Yeah, I think it's very important to understand this specific new take on how this can be used. So let's have a look at the several hosts of the planets in this chart of Mr. Jung. Again, the Domicilemaster has this task. He needs to provide for the guest, and he's delivering stuff for the guest to have his or her way with, the planet in this image. But you can also talk about it in a way that this planet familiarizes himself with the issues presented to it by means of the dispositor, the Domicilemaster of the said image. So let's have a look at these. So when we look at the sun is in its own domicile of the lion. So we can of course say that the sun provides for himself. So and this was always associated with what's called the fitness of a planet. The word fitness comes from Mr. Schmidt. Always when planets reside in their own images, they are said to be fit, and that contributes to the more beneficent principles that are produced by these planets. So that's quite an important thing. So try to remember that, because that's important in how to use the idea of what I previously talked about, strength. This is not necessarily about strength, but more about quality. And the quality is of course quite good when a planet can use its own material to manifest itself, which is actually what is said here. This planet is, by in a figure of speech, is its own clay, but it's also the potter working with his own material. So that's always a boon, right? A boost. Okay, when we look at Venus, Venus is of course in the domicile of looking at the moon, the moon is in the domicile of Venus, so Venus provides material for the moon to work with. And perhaps we can understand this as exploring this material, because we are talking also about the idea of familiarization. And whenever we talk about benefic planets, I think the idea of exploring is better than trying to say that a planet is either abusing or doing something nasty with the material that the host provides it with. So, okay, when we look at Mercury and Venus, we can see that the moon is the one providing material for both Venus and the moon. And of course, then we are also talking about a mutual reception, because the moon is in the domicile of Venus, and Venus is in the domicile of the moon. So that's an important thing. Okay, and the rest is of course as is this. The moon provides for Mars, delivers material for Mars to work with. Venus does so for Jupiter, and Saturn, Mr. Jung himself, provides for himself. In a previous talk, I also referred to that it's interesting to see this Mars being in the Archer, which is ruled, of course, by Jupiter. The Domicilemaster is Jupiter. So, and as Mars is the malefic node of the sect in favor in this chart, it's interesting to understand that Jung, of course, did a lot with religion, of course, which and also philosophy, and try to reduce a lot of it to psychology, because he wanted to be scientific, right? Check out Saturn in this in the water pore, which is a very scientific oriented principle, I think. But it's interesting that he was struggling with the things that Jupiter, the religion, provided him with in relation to things going on in the 11th place. And of course, Mars being there is also something, perhaps in a sort of a sense, maltreating whatever Jupiter, religion, philosophy is offering. So he wanted to break away from it or try to change it, because that is what Mars is always trying to do, to dispose of obstacles. So that's an interesting take on that. So keep that in mind. You can see here an example of how the guest in a certain image, domicile, is treating the material that is given to it or made available for this planet to work with or to do something with. So when Mars is doing something, when it's not of the favorite sect, it's trying to destroy it or do something with it that changes it or whatever, or tries to get rid of the difficulties which this person experiences in these topics. So okay, so this is quite a new take on how to evaluate planets and domiciles, and it hopefully provides you with a certain new way of understanding what's going on whenever you see a planet being in a certain image, and understanding the domicile master of this image as the host for that planet. That's an interesting new take on this material, I think. Okay, now let me first look at a certain recipe, also from the Liber Hermetis, the chapter called On the Signs in which the planets are located, and this is an example of something that can be said about these configurations. Whenever so whenever Jupiter is falling in the house of Venus, which is of course because this Jupiter in Jung's chart is in the image of the balance, the scales. So this is what the recipe says about it. So, and I find it interesting, but it's not always relevant, and it's not always appropriate for a chart, because there need to be, this is sort of a bottom line delineation for this, and this can be changed by means of several things happening with one of these planets. So this is a bottom line delineation of Jupiter being in one of the dignities of Venus, because it here it exactly says that it's in the house of Venus, the domicile, its phase, which is the decanate, or the degree, which has to do with the confines, the bounds. And then it says it makes great riches and happiness and glory, and it makes one a lord of everyone's possessions, etc. Ruler of villas and fields and estates, etc. An assessor, that is a sort of a president of a certain group of people. Honored by the mob and by cities. Many become priests of the gods, especially if the planets happen to be in the 3rd or 9th from the horoscope, which is the case of Jupiter, of course. Other build temples receiving girls, hey, Venus, girls, and presidents of the people, hearing from many, always being enriched by his acts, and they will have wives of great, and it's word was translated as area, but I'm not sure that is quite the adequate translation. Glorified by women, having benefit from women, they rule the republic and public, etc. They are public figures, etc., etc. Now this is of course quite interesting, and it could be right for Mr. Jung, and some of these statements are of course correct for the life of Jung. But this is what I try to do with it. So this is of course simply a recipe, a prescription almost, as to what this location of Jupiter in the domicile of Venus might indicate. And I also must emphasize that this recipe is of course addressing all the possible dignities that Jupiter can have by being in one of the dignities of Venus, be it either the image itself, its decan, its decanate, or the bounds of Venus. And of course Schmidt always said, I will not be satisfied by throwing it all in one heap and then coming out with the same recipe or the same description of what it might indicate. So this recipe is actually too broad, because it also throws on one heap all the separate dignities that Venus can have. So it's also a bit what you say, you can discuss about it whether or not this is an adequate way of describing what's happening with Jupiter in these separate topics, dignities relating to Venus. And Schmidt was of the opinion that it's not. So please keep that in mind. So this is a recipe. But what I try to do is working the idea of Venus being the host of Jupiter, and thus providing stuff for Jupiter to work with in a 9th house context. These are 3 principles that can be very interesting in delineating when you're talking about a certain chart. And this opens up, of course, interesting new ways of thinking about what's going on there. So, and sometimes I know, sorry people, that it is a struggle, because it's really asking the question, what is going on here? But it helps that we know a lot of Jung's biography, and this is the chart that we are researching, of course. And it quite adequately confirms and secures this way of reasoning, and I will show you how it does so. So, okay, so what I do is sort of that reasoning process that I just talked about and try to formulate a bit along these lines. I see Jupiter in the 9th, so of course it has to do with religion, philosophy, and academia, and that is the context in which Jupiter is working in this chart, operating in this chart, and also working in Jung's life, because that's where this planet is located, right? And we already saw how big this influence of Jupiter, of course, was, because it's applying via a trine with the ruler of the first place, Mr. Jung himself, with an aspect, and it's not testimony, this is an aspect, this is what Jupiter doing with Mr. Jung, and it's also a bonification, because Jupiter is of course a very benefic planet in his day chart, so this is something that Jung was very happy with, to have this influence, and these topics were of a great fun for him, very interesting to investigate further. So back to the idea of the Venus being the host of Jupiter, then I can now understand the role of Venus as its host to delivering material for Jupiter, offering to Jupiter in this chart, of course, to work with. So Jupiter in this chart, in Jung's life, Jung has to come to grips with, familiarize himself with Jupiter, and Jupiter of course is familiarizing himself also with the Venus stuff, and that's interesting. So you can say that Jupiter can do with this Venus stuff material to his heart's content. The question is, can he really to his heart's content? Because there are certain principles that define this specific role that these planets have with each other. Because we can see that this Venus is coming from the 10th place to Jupiter. So it's Venus and Mercury are both in the MC relative to the location of Jupiter, and that's a very important principle, and it's called superior position. So yeah, now every star that is fine, here's the definition, coming from definitions and foundations, etc. We know about this already. I've shown this many times before in other presentations, so that's important to take into account. But there's something else going on, because we now know what the task is of the Domicilemaster. Venus needs to provide for Jupiter, because it's the host of Jupiter being in its domicile. But we also see that both Venus, and especially of course now I emphasize Venus, but also Mercury, is zodiacally moving, both of them, towards Jupiter. Thus they are applying, and they will reach Jupiter before his location, before he leaves his location in the balance. So we must say that they are testifying to Jupiter. So okay, we have some new information here. So so far we have actually found three separate things to delineate about the relation of Jupiter, and the reason I take Jupiter because it's such an important principle for Jung, his life, because of the applying trine of Jupiter towards Saturn, the ruler of the first place, Mr. Jung himself. So that's the reason why I'm taking Jupiter now, and Jupiter is of course the guest in the house of Venus, and Venus Aphrodite is the host for Jupiter. But there's always also something else going on, so we have three different things now to delineate and talk about. The first one is, what is Jupiter doing with the material that his host Venus is supplying him with? Because, well, as this is all about what I talked about in previous slides. The second thing is that Venus is testifying to Jupiter by applying to him within the image that they both are in. So this is testimony. And the third thing we can see is also that Venus, being in the 10th place relative to Jupiter, is coming down on Jupiter. So this is a very strong input coming from Venus. So that's interesting to take into account. And the fourth thing that I will not address now is the fact that Mercury is co-present with Venus. So that also has a special relationship, but it does not come into the idea of the guest-host relation. That's something else. So, well, that's a lot, right? We got three new things to deal with and try to delineate, and these all have separate different meanings. That's very important to understand. You could just say, oh yeah, well, Venus is having a contact, is aspecting in modern parlance, or having a configuration with Jupiter, and it's also by means of a square, so that's a difficult one, etc., etc. But actually you have three different things to delineate by the fact that Jupiter is that Venus is the host for Jupiter, that Venus is coming down on Jupiter, and Venus is testifying to Jupiter. There are three different things. So again, you see the richness of this material, because it separates all the, it doesn't throw things on a heap, it separates them, and each thing has a different astrological meaning. So that's quite an achievement by Mr. Schmidt, I think. So again, there are three separate things to delineate, so I will start with the first one. What is Jupiter doing with the material that Venus, his host, is supplying him with? And we need to understand, because this is very important for this delineation about the chart of Mr. Jung, is that Mr. Jung himself, because Saturn is in aversion to these planets in the 6th place, being Venus and Mercury, they are his blind spots, they are secrets to him, and Jupiter and the Moon informs him about these secrets, right? I explained this in my previous video, the first one of the Jung Talks, so that's very important to take into account, because this has a lot to do with the way that this is experienced by Jung himself. So let's have a look at it. So I would formulate my delineation, my reasoning process a bit something like this. The religious contact of Jupiter in the 9th place is also fraught with something mysterious, for Jung that is, a secret having to do with desire, perhaps sexuality and other Venus significations, the femininity principle, which Jung must have suspected as being part and parcel of religion, and religion being a topic that had a profound influence on him, as Jupiter bonifies Saturn and has a very dominant influence on Mr. Jung. So I suspect that Jung understood the difficulty of institutionalized religion to come to grips with these issues due to the tetragonal configuration of Venus being square to this Jupiter. And whenever there's a square principle, that has to do with struggles, right? So the institutionalized religion, or the people representing religion for Jung in his youth, were struggling with these issues. That's also very true in his life. So he probably was aware of this struggle, as he saw people of the clergy struggle with this, and his father being one of them, of course. And the secret, or this dark side of religion, must have fascinated him all his life, due to the compelling and dominating aspect from Jupiter with Saturn, Mr. Jung himself. So I hope this shows how this might be interpreted in this chart. And of course we know a lot about Jung, and this delineation of mine is also, of course, somewhat informed by what I know of Mr. Jung, his youth, etc. But I hope you can see that this also follows from these principles. So that's the first take on this. And it's of course very interesting that Schmidt said that Aphrodite Venus has to do with what we might call religious piety or rites of purification that would precede religious ritual. Of course, that's sort of an attitude having to do, and is perhaps also related to religious principles. And Zeus himself has to do with the priesthood and gnosis and the knowledge of spiritual truths. And I think a lot of Jung adepts would say that Mr. Jung was very much into the knowledge of these spiritual truths, which he uncovered sort of by means of how he interpreted all this in terms of the depth psychology, the psychoanalysis, the school of analytical psychology, that he was the master of. Okay. So looking again at the very powerful influence of Jupiter on Mr. Jung, Jupiter is also coming down upon Saturn, because it's coming from the 9th place relative to Saturn, and that's also the place of divination. And that's also quite interesting, simply because whenever this Jupiter is also informed by something secretive for Mr. Jung. And as I said, Aphrodite Venus has to do with religious piety and purifications and things having to do with religious ritual. But it applies to divination as well, of course, as a source of understanding the secrets that pertain to religion, because that has a lot to do with how we understand religion by means of rituals. And of course the church has standardized rituals for everything having to do with coming to grips with the higher power in our life, and of course in Christianity that is God, or be it Allah or whatever. And Zeus, of course, as being representative of the priesthood, etc. And again, as I state here, Jung was, of course, immersed in religious proceedings and rites through his father and the rest of the family, who were all in the clergy, or most of them. And it's how these secrets presented themselves. It was all sort of in the guise, so to speak, of religion itself, the bread and butter of Jung's youth, because he was really immersed in all this material. The playgrounds he had were churches and graveyards in his youth. And he was a single child up to his 9th year, so he's very isolated in that sense. And of course, divination was abundantly practiced in his youth and in his surroundings, as I said in the previous video, and he had a keen interest in them. And according to some biographers, Jung himself also had these sort of gifts, so this was sort of natural, something quite natural to him, or something not to be frowned at or something. So, and of course, Jung graduated for his doctor thesis by using the seances he did with Helene Price work, that was his niece, I believe. And this is what Jung himself said: this was the first, it made it possible for me to achieve a psychological point of view. I had discovered some objective facts about the human psyche. So, and he did so with this presentation. And the interesting thing is that he refers to objectivity rather than subjective experiences, because whenever it's subjective, it doesn't have an objective relation to something psychological. Then it's simply some manifestation of something going on in a person's life, him or herself, and that is then shown in by means of the things people say when they are having a seance, or whenever they are a medium transmitting messages from beyond, right? So, yeah, that's interesting that Jung said that. And this is the thesis this dissertation that he used to get his degree as a doctor. So, okay, so here we have some very important things having to do with the very important influence of religion on Jung's life, and this was also much fed by the more darker side of religion as it was perceived by the traditional churches, because they always thought that the spiritual use of these sort of phenomena, occult phenomena, were of course very discredited by the official church. Okay, now we come to the second part of these three separate things to delineate with relation to how planets configure with each other. And here we see that Venus, because it's applying to Jupiter, and this application will form within the images where they both are, Venus and Jupiter. So that is the definition of testimony. So Venus is testifying to Jupiter. And that's quite interesting, because it also says something specific about what's going on between these two planets. Of course, the fact that Venus is of the Domicilemaster of Jupiter is, of course, quite important, because Jupiter is working with the material that Venus is providing. But there's also something specific going on, namely in the sense that Venus is also testifying to Jupiter in a certain way, and it's coming from superior position, so it's also quite strong, but I will address this in a minute. So what we can say about this is that both Venus and of course Mercury as well keep testifying to Jupiter about the hidden side of religion, hidden to Jung of course, because it is the hidden side of religion, of course, all the things having to do with these meditational things. Meditation, of course, is a somewhat hidden side of religion nowadays, and all seances and afterlife, etc., etc. That's all something that the regular church, the formal church has monopolized on, if that's the right word of saying it. But try to understand that, of course, Venus has to do with religious piety and rites of purification, things that have to do with religious ritual. And of course, the church is very strong on these rituals, but these are also something, things hidden to Jung personally, simply because he cannot see things going on in the sixth place. So that's an interesting thing, but the Venus keeps informing Jupiter, and Jupiter is, in this case, in the sense how Jung is experiencing religion, keeps informing Jupiter about this hidden side that's going on there, for Jung that is again, because simply Jupiter is informed by these rituals, although they are secret to Jung, because of this sixth place aversion to his ruler of the first place. And of course, Jupiter himself is representative of priesthood and gnosis, the knowledge of spiritual truths, and they are also very strongly influenced, of course, by this testimony relationship of Venus to Jupiter. So yeah, this Jupiter is pretty much steeped in Venusian qualities having to do with the more feminine, darker side of religion and perhaps even pagan rituals, etc. Everything that has to do with rites of purification, etc. It's all Venus-like in this chart, that is. So, okay. Now the third thing going on with this configuration is that Venus is coming down on Jupiter from a superior position, because of course we see that Venus is in the 10th place relative to Jupiter, so this is a superior position, which means that Venus is in a sense decimating the impact of Jupiter. In this case, this must be beneficial in the sense that Venus is actually imposing itself very strongly on Jupiter, and that is to Jung, of course, and there's also a strong hint for Jung then that there is something going on with religion, and this Venus keeps informing this Jupiter about the hidden side, and that's what the package is in religion for Jung, simply because it's the way that this Venus is imposing itself upon Jupiter, so to speak. So there's always this hint of there is something more going on here than meets the eye through these rituals that the priesthood Jupiter is performing. Now, Schmidt said something very interesting about this testimony relationship, especially when it's coming from the 10th place. And then he says that this sort of testimony is compelling. And in other principle, the zodiacal releasing tapes also state very emphatically that whenever such a planet is coming down upon another planet, it's almost impossible for the planet and the person to avoid the influence of this planet that's coming down via this position. So Schmidt also said, and in that case it's quite overwhelming as well. You can hardly escape it. It's overwhelming. You cannot resist it in a sense. So there's this strong influence of this Venus and also Mercury impulse on this Jupiter stuff. So yeah, this is how Jung experienced it. So I must again state emphatically that this is not about religion in general, although there are of course very interesting themes that are really indeed happening and are indeed part and parcel of how we experience religion, especially when you are into astrology and all this sort of knowledge. Then you know there is, let's say, a worldly side to religion, whatever form you believe in or you practice, and there's also this hidden side which is more mysterious and more esoteric, so to speak. And that's of course a general statement about religion, but for Jung this was a very important one because it's the way he experienced this very strong impulse having to do in his life coming from Jupiter in the ninth, because it's in such a strong and also very beneficent trigon to his ruler of the first place, being Saturn. So please understand, don't forget that we are still talking about the chart of Jung, and this can be going on in anyone's chart, but in a different way, and then we have to make different conclusions about what's going on in this chart. But here I hope I have shown and can show that this is a very important principle having to do with Jung's life, and that this is a very important thing to do in any chart, trying to figure out what's going on with this planet, and what is the perhaps hidden side from a planet whenever it's in aversion with the ruler of the first place. Whenever the ruler of the first place is in aversion to something, you cannot see what that planet is representing, the one that's averse to the Lord of the First, and then you have to try to find out which planet is informing you about the thing that you cannot see directly. And of course that's a very interesting thing for somebody talking about the unconscious. As I said, my definitions, or rather the astrological definition of what is unconscious, is actually whenever something is unconscious to you, you cannot see it, simply. That's a very simple definition of what the unconscious is, and that's quite an interesting astrological principle, that you are unconscious of planets that you cannot see, and that's a very interesting astrological definition of what the unconscious represents. So let's have a further look. Okay, I return again to the very strong influence of Jupiter, who is coming down upon Saturn, which is Jung himself, coming from the ninth place, the place of divination. Okay, that's interesting, but of course we need to understand what's going on with this Venus-Mercury stuff going on in the sixth place. And of course, because they are in the crab, they are under the disposition, the domicile mastership of the moon, which is a very strong planet simply because she's in an angle, but she's also of quite good quality because she's in a sign of exaltation. So then we can conclude that these hidden things are also much informed coming from the moon in the fourth place. So you could say that the moon is hosting whatever is going on with Venus and Mercury in this invisible sixth place. And it's rooted in something coming from the fourth. And of course, the fourth place is the youth of a person, having to do with circumstances surrounding the person from youth or in youth, and the parental home, etc., etc. Okay, so that's very interesting, and it's also quite interesting that Fallon says that the fourth place is a place of mysteries. So that's about ancient mysteries, which include, of course, alchemy, astrology, etc. So what did Jung discover there? Because I'm saying this because, of course, the moon is also testifying to Saturn about Venus and Mercury, because as I spoke of this in the first video on this topic, the moon is applying to Saturn, and the moon can see the planets in her own image, the crab, by means of a sextile configuration. So yeah, the moon is testifying to Jung about the stuff going on in the sixth place. So that sort of explains, and the powerful, of course, the powerful location of this moon, because it's in an angle, an angular place, a pivotal place, sorry, there are no angles in round chart. This is a pivotal place, so it's a very important and very strong influence, and it influences Jung, of course, quite strongly from his youth, but also from the fourth place, having to do with ancient mysteries. So Jung discovered stuff, or he used this material to get a grip on what was going on with Venus and Mercury in this hidden place, this dark place for him. So that's interesting. So what did he discover there? He finally formulated things about the anima and the animus, which I say that the anima is Venus and Mercury is the animus. Interesting stuff. So yeah, So Jung delved into alchemy and he delved into astrology pretty soon in his career, that is. And the interesting thing is that on this picture on the book on Jung on astrology, you see something that he himself did. As I said, Saturn is the planet working with stone, of course, and there you see some symbolism. You see the moon, you see Mercury, the male figure, the manly figure, the human figure, which has Mercury chiseled in on its front, and then the moon, of course. And these three planets are always very important in ancient astrology as well, because Mercury is a very important planet for the human being, because Aristotle said that human beings are the only living beings capable of speech. So that's, of course, Mercury in our language. So that's interesting. So yeah, Jung started studying astrology, and he said astrology is assured of recognition from psychology without further restrictions, because astrology represents the summation of all the psychological knowledge of antiquity. Interesting quote. I'm not quite sure if I would completely agree with this. But yes, there is, of course, a very strong psychological dimension to astrology in general. I'm not sure if it would be stated in this sense in the ancient literature, but that's okay. And of course, Jung was, of course, a very strong supporter of astrology as a means of trying to get into the secrets of somebody's life, something that I'm trying to do here as well, and trying to explain why, in this case, in Jung's case, this religion stuff and these mysteries are so important to him. Okay, now people might object to calling Mercury the animus, the hidden male side in female nativities, but I find this in the Wikipedia. Animus originated from Latin, where it was used to describe ideas such as the rational soul, hey, male, often associated with male stuff, rationality, as opposed to emotionality, the mind, mental powers, etc. So that's the reason why I think the animus is strongly represented by Mercury, and I think Jung would agree with me. So, okay, let's have a further look. Another piece of the puzzle of all this material in Jung's chart is that there is something else that stands out in this chart, that is the very strong receptions going on between these factors in his chart. So Venus is, of course, in the domicile of the moon, and the moon itself is in the domicile of Venus. So there we have the mutual reception. That's quite a strong one, and that's also the case with Venus and Jupiter, because Jupiter is, of course, in the domicile of Venus, but Venus is in the exaltation sign image of Jupiter, and these are all also pretty strong, proposed as being very intense relations between planets, because they sort of are taking care of each other. So that's quite a thing to take into account, because these things are so loaded in Jung's life, and they cannot escape each other, as it were. So they keep informing each other, and they keep having this very strong relation with each other, and they take care of each other. So let me again state why this is so important. It's important because Jung cannot see Venus and Mercury, and both Jupiter and the moon are informing Saturn about the things going on with Venus and Mercury in the sixth place, the place that he cannot see. So they testify to Jung about Venus and Mercury, so that's important. Now what you also can see is that, again, this definition is by Porphyry, the overcoming situation. So we also noted that Venus is in superior position to Jupiter, but the moon is also in an overcoming position in relation to Mercury and Venus, especially Venus, because that's still an applying aspect, so they are also in aspect, which means that the moon is really doing something with Venus, which is of course one of these statements about aspects. They are no longer simply assuming a figure, now they are really engaging with each other. So the moon is engaging with Venus and vice versa, I think. So again, this is again emphasizing the strength of all this testimony, what's going on about what's going on with Venus and Mercury, and how strong these impulses are. And the reason that they are invisible to Jung, because Venus and Mercury are invisible to his Saturn, his own planet, the planet that represents him in this chart, of course gives it a very loaded signification. And it's also very important to understand that this is something that fascinated him, because there was something lurking there which could be formulated. This is a very interesting secret, and this secret is revealed to him through formal religion, but also through the moon, which is of course all the seance work and all the other methods trying to figure out what's going on in the background, and of course in the psyche of the human being. So that's a very interesting observation. So this is a very loaded, these are very loaded principles having to do with Venus and Mercury, and they are represented to Jung by means of the moon and by means of Jupiter. And that's the reason why he was, I think, so fascinated with this material. Fascination, of course, simply because this Jupiter has this very strong impact on his ruler of the first place, and there's always this hidden stuff going on which fascinated him from early youth. So another interesting thing that could be perhaps gleaned from this chart and the relations between planets is that, of course, we all know there is some sort of repressed femininity in religion, official religion, that is, the worldly church, so to speak. And perhaps we can see something about that in this chart as well, because Saturn, of course, itself is in aversion to Venus, which is the feminine principle. And we also see in this chart the aversion between Jupiter, which is a very strong influence on Jung, and its aversion with the moon. So yeah, we could perhaps see some sort of repressed femininity in Jung himself, but that's perhaps a given for any male chart. But perhaps there's something there in the issue having to do with Jung himself, and something that he really was a strong how do you call it, somebody who really shone light on that side of religion, which had to do, of course, with the what we would now call Wicca, etc. That's a very important feminine principle going on in religion nowadays, in the New Age sort of types of religion. So I'm not quite sure if I'm saying this correctly, but that's an interesting thing. But I know less about this than other things in Jung's chart, so I'm not going to delve in this further, but it's an interesting thing to observe in his chart, right? So, okay. Well, as I said, I will be dealing with the other essential dignities in further videos, because as you have now noticed, this is a very intense and deep treatment of this guest-host relation between going on between planets being located in certain domiciles under the rule of a Domicilemaster, which is the host for this planet that is its guest. So that's I hope you find it interesting, and I hope it will deepen your understanding of charts. But I will, of course, continue with the other essential dignities. So this means that the next video will be about the exaltations, in which I will use the image of Downton Abbey to explain the relation between a Domicilemaster and the exaltation rule of a certain image. So that's coming up. So I would also like to show you this thing. If you find any use for these videos and would like to contribute to the growth of my channel, please feel free to contribute financially. There's no obligation to do so, but if you like these videos, please do so. And of course I want to thank everybody for their contributions, because I can say that these videos are, to my mind at least, are quite successful, because they tell people something about Hellenistic astrology in a practical sense, which is quite a feat to achieve, simply because it's pretty intense material and it's also quite difficult at certain points. So I'm hoping this will show you how I deal with all the new information coming from these texts from Mr. Schmidt, and I'm very grateful to him for having done all this work, and it really has enhanced my astrology enormously. And I hope I could have shown this, can show this to you by means of these videos. Yeah. So please continue to enjoy them. Please continue to write comments on them and ask questions, because I'm always up for them, and it's also very interesting to see how other people think about these things. So, of course, I also do natal chart delineations. They are all based on these Hellenistic principles, simply because, as you can here, when you listen to these videos, I have done quite some research into all this material and trying to understand how you can use it in natal charts. So that might be a surprise for your own chart whenever you have it delineated in this way. So it's an in-depth study of your chart, etc. So if you please feel free to contact me if you are interested in such a delineation. So I would like to do that for you, and hope you will enjoy them as much as I do. So I hope to see you next time in the next talk about the delineation of the chart of Jung, which will then be addressing the issue of the exaltation. So I hope to see you then. Keep well, and give it a thumbs up, spread this video to anyone who's interested in this material. So let's keep up the good work of continuing to get Hellenistic astrology on the map for people to refer to. So see you next time.